Fushimi Castle, September 1600. Inside its burning walls, a 61-year-old castellan and fewer than 2,000 men have held off 40,000 attackers for 11 straight days. He knows help is not coming. Why would Torii Mototada choose a battle he could never win? He held a castle with 2,000 men against 40,000. He knew he would never leave it alive. Why would a loyal samurai choose a battle he could not survive? Torii Mototada was born in 1539, the son of a retainer who had served the Mitsunari clan since before its young lord was born. As a boy, Mototada was sent to attend that lord during his years as a hostage in the rival Imagawa domain of Sunpu, a humiliating exile the boy endured alongside him. The lord's name was Matsudaira Takechiyo. History would remember him as Tokugawa Ieyasu. Decades before either man held power, they grew up together in another clan's custody, and Mototada's loyalty to him began there, in captivity, long before there was anything to gain from it. For the next 4 decades, Mototada served Ieyasu without interruption, through defeats that nearly ended him and victories that built his power. He fought at Anegawa in 1570 and at Sekigahara in 1572, one of the worst maulings of Ieyasu's career. He fought through the long consolidation of the Kanto after 1590. He held no ambition to rule anything himself. Other retainers schemed for titles and land. Mototada simply appeared, campaign after campaign, wherever Ieyasu needed him. A plain, unglamorous constancy that over 40 years became its own kind of reputation. By 1598, Ieyasu was the most powerful of the 5 regents left to guard Toyotomi Hideyoshi's young heir, and he governed increasingly from Fushimi Castle, south of Kyoto. Mototada, by then nearing 60, was given command of it as castellan, a position of trust, not combat. Political tension in Japan was rising fast as rival factions maneuvered for control after Hideyoshi's death. Few in Fushimi's garrison could have guessed how quickly that trust would be tested, or how completely. In the summer of 1600, Ieyasu resolved to march east against the Uesugi clan of Aizu, who had defied his authority and were fortifying their domain. He suspected the move would provoke exactly the response he wanted. His rival Ishida Mitsunari, freed of Ieyasu's presence in the capital, would raise a Western coalition against him and reveal himself as an enemy Ieyasu could then destroy in open battle. But someone had to hold Fushimi Castle while that trap sprang shut, knowing the castle itself could not be saved. Ieyasu turned to the one man he trusted with an order like that. Before he left, Ieyasu offered to strengthen Fushimi's garrison further. Mototada refused. Every additional soldier left behind, he said, was one fewer soldier Ieyasu would have when the real battle came, and Fushimi's fall was not really in question either way. The 2 men, who had shared captivity as boys 40 years earlier, sat together and drank through the night, both understanding without needing to say it that they would not meet again. In the morning, Ieyasu rode east with his army. Mototada stayed behind with fewer than 2,000 men to face a war he could not win. Mototada spent his final weeks preparing Fushimi as though he expected to hold it forever. He drilled the garrison, checked the walls, and rationed supplies for a long siege he privately knew would not last that long. He also sat down and wrote a letter to his son, Tadamasa, who served elsewhere with Ieyasu's main army. In it, he set down, calmly and without complaint, exactly why he had chosen to stay, and what he expected of his son once he was gone. The letter said that a lord who had shown Mototada such favor for so many decades deserved a retainer willing to die for him without hesitation, and that dying at Fushimi was not a tragedy, but the debt of a lifetime finally being repaid. He told his son to feel no grief, only to serve Ieyasu as faithfully as his father had. Centuries later, historians would call it one of the clearest surviving statements of a samurai's reasoning for choosing death over survival, written not in the heat of battle, but weeks in advance, in full possession of his choice. In late August 1600, an army of roughly 40,000 men under Ishida Mitsunari's coalition surrounded Fushimi Castle. Inside, Mototada commanded fewer than 2,000 defenders, soldiers, retainers, and men who had simply refused to leave when they had the chance. The odds were not subtle. 20 attackers for every defender, no relief force coming, and no realistic path to survival. Mototada gave the order to hold the gates anyway, and the siege of Fushimi Castle began. For the first several days, the defenders held every line Mototada set for them. He led sorties out through the gates himself, despite his age, striking at siege works before falling back inside the walls. Each assault the coalition threw at Fushimi cost its soldiers it had not expected to lose to a garrison this small. Word of the resistance began reaching Ieyasu's allies elsewhere in Japan. Proof that Ishida Mitsunari's coalition could be made to bleed. Every day Fushimi held was a day Ieyasu's own army gained in the east. And Mototada knew it. The siege stretched past a week, and then further. An outcome almost nobody on either side had expected from a garrison this size. Food and water ran low inside the walls. Men fell to wounds and exhaustion rather than retreat. Mototada continued directing the defense from wherever the fighting was worst, giving the coalition commanders outside no sign that the castle was anywhere close to breaking. By the 11th day, Fushimi Castle, meant by most calculations to fall within 2 or 3, was still standing, and still costing Ishida Mitsunari time he could not afford to lose. The end came not from the front, but from within. Among the defenders were local Koga warriors whose families Ishida's side held hostage elsewhere, and under that pressure, a group of them set fire to one of Fushimi's towers from inside the walls. The blaze tore through the castle's defenses in minutes, opening a breach no swordsmanship could hold closed. Coalition troops poured through the gap by the hundreds. Mototada, watching his 11-day defense collapse in an afternoon, gathered what remained of his men and prepared for the fighting that was left.
Mototada fought in the final collapse of his own castle rather than attempt to flee it. When the position was plainly lost, he took his own life by seppuku inside the burning walls, as did most of the officers who had served beside him. Of the roughly 1,800 men who had held Fushimi Castle, almost none survived. The garrison was annihilated rather than surrendered. Fushimi Castle fell on the 8th of September 1600, 11 days after the siege began, exactly as its castellan had always expected it would.
Mototada's stand did not save Fushimi Castle, and it was never meant to. It bought 11 days that Ishida Mitsunari's coalition spent fighting a garrison of under 2,000 men instead of chasing Ieyasu's army east. In those 11 days, Ieyasu's allies gathered, wavering lords made up their minds, and the Eastern Army assembled itself into a force ready to meet the coalition on open ground. Every hour Fushimi held was an hour Ieyasu did not have to fight blind, and Mototada had known that arithmetic before the first arrow was ever loosed.
6 weeks later, on the 15th of the 9th month by the old calendar, the 21st of October, 1600, the two armies met at Sekigahara. Ieyasu's forces broke Ishida Mitsunari's coalition in a single day, deciding, in effect, who would rule Japan. Historians still debate how much any single factor determined that outcome, but Ieyasu himself credited Fushimi's resistance with buying him the time and the intelligence he needed to prepare it properly. The castellan who died at the start of the campaign never saw the battle his sacrifice helped make possible.
3 years later, in 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu was named shogun, founding a shogunate that would rule Japan for the next 260 years. Torii Mototada's son, Tadamasa, inherited his father's domain and status, exactly as the farewell letter from Fushimi had asked of him. The Torii clan went on serving the Tokugawa shogunate for generations, a debt of loyalty repaid many times over on both sides. None of it happened by accident. Every piece of it had been calculated weeks in advance by a man who chose to die so that the calculation would work.
What remained of Fushimi Castle's interior floors, soaked with the blood of Mototada and his men, was left untouched for years after the siege. Eventually, the boards were removed and installed as ceiling panels in several temples around Kyoto, including Yoganin and Genkoan, so that no one would ever again walk across the ground where they had died. Those blood ceilings, Chi Tenjo, can still be seen today. Faint, dark outlines of hands and bodies preserved in the wood. A physical record of 11 days most of Japan had assumed no one could survive. Mototada's stand endures in Japan, not as a story of desperation, but of precision. A man who understood exactly what his death was worth and chose to spend it deliberately. He was not fighting to win. He had done the arithmetic and accepted the answer years, maybe decades before the siege ever began. In a warrior culture that prized loyalty above almost anything else, his farewell letter, and his 11 days at Fushimi became the standard against which later generations measured what genuine, unforced devotion to a lord was supposed to look like.
Next time on Samurai Chronicles, a mid-ranking retainer of a powerful domain in northern Japan is chosen for an almost unimaginable mission. Sail across the Pacific, cross Mexico, cross the Atlantic, and carry his lord's letters all the way to Rome to be received by the Pope himself. The voyage takes years, and by the time he returns home, everything has changed. The country that sent him no longer wants what he worked so hard to bring back. This is the true story of Hasekura Tsunenaga, the real ambassador of the Keicho embassy to Rome.
Torii Mototada held Fushimi Castle for 11 days against impossible odds, and gave Tokugawa Ieyasu the time he needed to win the war that made him shogun. Subscribe to Samurai Chronicles for a new story from Japanese history every single day.